of modern science, I am enabled this Christmas Day to speak to all my peoples throughout the empire. For the second time in the lives of most of us, we are at war.
I, Charles, Prince of Wales, do become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship.
The old Market Street of the City of London.
Make it snappy, said Miss Ferguson.
Just a fact.
Once more for luck, sir. Once is quite enough.
Actually, that's Neville. Can you hear me?
Yes, Tim.
Could you just be the bride, please, and walk out of the Abbey?
Yes, I'm by the awning at the front. Where would you like me to start?
Start from the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior. I'm looking at you from outside, Neville. So if you come out the door, you've been married. Excellent. It's a lovely bride.
The wedding of two young people in the summer of 1986. Another milestone in broadcasting's long-running love affair with royalty.
Let's go to 12, then.
Good morning.
Good morning. The really superb shots of people arriving. Of the Queen arriving, of the couple arriving. Right. What have you got on the Abbey?
This is David Dimbleby. I'm on TX, whatever it is, on the proper side.
David, could you just talk to me?
You've got slightly less hair than Selina.
I get masses of letters on these occasions about people wanting to see fashions. So you'll find in that first sort of half ad, there's a lot of stuff where we're going to just watch the people arriving, see who's coming, see what they're wearing, which it strikes me there's great fascination. The audience want to see a lot of that.
The lighting is all cockeyed at the moment, isn't it? It won't be lit like this.
If you can find the faces we recognise, Mrs. Reagan coming in the West Door, for instance, people like that, that's obviously helpful. So I think they're fairly shared out among everyone.
Oh, that's nice, yes. The porch of Clarence House, at the front of Clarence House, the home of the Queen Mother, where Sarah Ferguson spent the night.
So I get the bride on the way. The groom is also on the way. Come back here to see the Queen arrive. It's page 18.
After 50 years of royal coverage, the camera script almost writes itself. But back in the days of wireless and newsreel, monarchy was more remote. In the 1922 cinema newsreels, Princess Mary at her wedding was a distant, furry flicker. 1923 and the wedding of Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon brought no finer focus. In 1934, the newsreel cameras still kept a respectful distance from Princess Marina of Greece. But in 1947, they were closing in on Princess Elizabeth. Princess Margaret in 1960 and the first television bridal close-up, followed by Princess Alexandra in 1963. 10 years later, the cameras are almost treading on the train of Princess Anne. And for Miss Sarah Ferguson's wedding last year, no angle was left unshot.
world at peace, there is no war, and train is backing up once more, and once more down at Wembley.
At the Empire exhibition, George V was the first monarch to have his words broadcast. 10 million people listened in to what they called the Royal Loudspeaking.
To come here today with the Queen for the purpose of opening the British Empire exhibition.
In spite of its success and the growing popularity of wireless, it was to be another 8 years before the BBC persuaded the King to repeat the experiment. For a court steeped in Victorian values, the medium was still a little too modern. But when the King did agree, he changed the very nature of royal communication.
Well, the first time I ever heard a royal voice, you might say, on radio was 1932, when the King, George V, made his first and famous broadcast to the Empire family.
London calling the British Empire.
London calling the continent of
London
Africa.
calling the Indian Empire.
London calling the Commonwealth of
London
Australia.
calling the Dominion of Canada.
I speak now from my home and from my heart to you all.
Every Christmas became a tradition. We treated it as a royal occasion at home. We finished our Christmas dinner, and then, in time, all gathered round the radio set, turned it on, and then came the voice of the monarch actually entering our own home. It was an amazing occasion. There's no question about it. The whole of people around the world reacted to it. To hear the King speaking personally to you on Christmas Day, it was stunning.
To all, to each, I wish a happy Christmas. God bless you.
At last the King had stepped down from a rather dusty throne and became one of them, and was a human being, and talked to them as though they were friends and colleagues.
The spontaneous affection at his Jubilee in 1935 showed how wireless had brought the monarch closer to his people than ever before. Grandpa England, as he was known, again spoke simply and directly to his Empire family.
To the children, I would like to send a special message. The King is speaking to you. I ask you to remember that in days to come, you will be the citizens of a great empire. As you grow up, always keep this thought before you.
I think radio played a huge part in really making George V a very respected and beloved monarch. And I think without radio, I'm sure that the monarchy, well, it wouldn't have not survived. Of course it would, but it certainly wouldn't have had the strength it's got now.
To the Chairman of the Board of Governors.
The King feels that through the agency of the BBC, he has been brought into closer and more personal relations with his people than could otherwise have been possible.
The new stone battleship of Broadcasting House sailed under a royal charter. At times, the BBC seemed to suffer from delusions of royalty itself. When the old king died, Sir John Reith spoke with almost princely piety.
With our fellow citizens at home and overseas, we affirm our loyalty to the Crown.
So Reith gave the orders that for the rest of that day, or the whole of that day, there should be no broadcasting of entertainment at all. News bulletins, weather forecasts, yes, but no programs. Mark you, this will never happen nowadays. There's another tragedy with the royal family. It'll be a scramble who gets there first. But at that time, they shut up shop.
With Edward VIII, for the first time, royalty came to the studio. Up till then, the BBC had always gone to the palace. Edward popularized the word radio. He struck out references to wireless in his script as he updated the traditional written message of the new king to his subjects.
Science has made it possible for me to make that written message more personal and to speak to you all over the radio.
The coming of the king brought out the crowds and inside a panic of protocol. The memorandum for the visit covered 2 pages of dense typescript, most of it taken up in contingency planning for the ritual of the BBC tea ceremony.
The tea, crockery, etc., to be on a wheeled trolley for transportation into the DG's office. A duplicate lot of food with crockery must be prepared in case of any accident with the original supply.
A mighty maze of mystic magic rays is all about us in the blue. And in sight and sound they trace living pictures out of space to bring a new wonder to you.
Edward was the first member of the royal family to be televised, his features used as the test card for the cameras. With a thoroughly modern monarchy, it was assumed that the coronation service would be televised.
King Edward VIII was extraordinarily interested in communicating, and he saw at once that through the radio and afterwards perhaps television, this would be his best method of communicating with the people. He wanted to be the people's king.
But a crowned king he was never to be. While Fleet Street was erupting with the sensation of the abdication crisis, there was no hint of it from the BBC. None of the constitutional comings and goings in Downing Street were reported. Only 7 days before the final abdication did the BBC address itself to the situation.
A statement by us would help to put the brake on exaggeration, and listeners will be looking to us for calm news.
Too calm, many people thought. The BBC's bulletins were felt to have failed the public.
The quiet, dulcet tones of the announcer might have been handling a small fire, for all the public knew.
Sir John Reith ordered the playing of solemn music for the last 2 days of the crisis. The BBC was criticised for its funereal attitude, and the Director General for his edict suspending normal service. The BBC, for all its royal charter, was a royal mouthpiece only at the very end.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own.
He actually chose to make his famous abdication speech on the radio, whereas other monarchs might well have been satisfied with signing the documents, and that was that. And as a matter of fact, Edward VIII really wanted to go much further in using the radio. He wanted to make a speech before the abdication was decided and put his case against the cabinet case. He was egged on by Mrs. Simpson, as she was then, and she, I think, would have encouraged him to be what you might call a radio or television monarch if they'd retained the throne and if he had married her.
Television prepared for the coronation. Same date, different king, said George VI, but not, it seemed, the same broadcasting arrangements.
The question of television came before the meeting of the Coronation Joint Committee. They concluded that it would be undesirable to grant facilities for the setting up in the Abbey of any apparatus for this purpose.
Television had to wait outside just like everyone else. 3 brand new cameras were set up at Hyde Park Corner. No one was sure they would work on the day, least of all the BBC.
We knew that if we flop at this, we're sunk. Our money will come off and we shall be considered absolute lunatics and irresponsible.
It was as critical as that?
I think so. I think it was absolutely critical.
If a cable had broken down or something?
Oh, my God. It's impossible to think of it. And I got down to that Hyde Park Corner, I think, 4 in the morning. And we got everything done, and Leslie Barbrook, who was our cameraman, got under the television camera. And for the record, he took a film of exactly what the camera saw as they came forward.
Those 8 magnificent greys drawing on that almost unbelievable stagecoach with their Majesties the King and Queen.
Television came through its first ever outside broadcast in triumph, and to the obvious relief of at least one pioneering cameraman. It was a small miracle. Only 10,000 people saw it. 25 million tuned to the radio and the vivid word pictures of Tommy Woodruff.
And this incredible, marvelous, coruscating, scintillating coach
And inside it, I can see through now. They've got the light on because it's a dark day. They've got an electric light on inside. I can see the king and queen. And they look incredible. They look like something out of a picture book. You can't believe it. It makes us all feel that we're 7 years old again.
I'll never forget, the very first big broadcast I had to do was with Tommy Woodruff on the return procession after the coronation. And we were in the commentary box on Constitution Hill. I can see us now. We were fully dressed in morning coat, correct morning outfit, because Sir John Reith, as he then was, had ordained anything that's connected with the royal occasion you must be royally dressed for it. So there we were walking through the crowd in our full big morning coat to sit in a little tatty commentary box in the midst of this roaring mob. But we kept form. We showed that the BBC meant something. And of course it did in those days. I remember as I walked towards that commentary box and started to get into it, somebody actually came up and touched me and said, "I've touched the BBC."
But politics soon cast a drizzle over the enthusiasm. From the Labour benches, Clement Attlee told the House of Commons that the BBC and the press had got the whole business out of proportion.
Of late years, I think there has been far too much boosting of royalty in the press and on the wireless. A reasonable pageantry now and again, well and good, but what we have had has been a fulsome adulation, the vulgar snobbery of a large section of the press. And there has been a more refined civility in other organs of the press and in the BBC. It is undesirable that the public should be indoctrinated with an entirely false idea of the importance of the throne.
Despite that, the public appetite for royal events was insatiable. For the BBC, the royals were royal box office. But the more the BBC pushed at the palace, the more the palace pulled back.
Any chance of His Majesty being willing to broadcast a short message?
His Majesty does not wish to undertake any regional broadcasts this year.
I fear there's no chance of His Majesty broadcasting on the evening of Sunday, July the 2nd.
The King has made a good many speeches on the air, and I think it's time that we drew in our horns a bit.
A day in the life of the King does not appeal to His Majesty.
We do not consider it desirable to have too frequent broadcasts of His Majesty's speeches and thereby cheapen the significance of such occasions.
Neville Chamberlain's return from Munich and his meeting with Hitler was televised, but soon brought a frostiness between the palace and the corporation. The King's message of national thanksgiving was conveyed to the news agencies who supplied the national press. But the BBC was specifically excluded. The message was not to be broadcast. It could only be carried in print. The BBC worked itself up into a majestic huff. Memos flew. Was this a suitable reward for the BBC's tremendous efforts? What game is the palace playing? Are we not to be trusted? These conditions are intolerable. We hope the attitude of ignoring broadcasting can be cleared up. BBC management went to the palace for an explanation.
A message which had taken very careful drafting should appear first in cold print, so as to avoid the possibility of listeners hearing it wrong or detecting some unintended emphasis owing to possible unconscious stress laid on parts of the message by the announcer who read it.
The BBC took the point. Meanwhile, television was in action,
And here's the King.
pioneering new adventures in broadcasting. In 1939, for the first time, 2 separate outside broadcast units covered the King and Queen's return from a royal tour of Canada. At last, television was beginning to challenge the supremacy of the cinema newsreels. But the days of television were numbered. The service was suspended for the duration. The BBC's wartime relationship with the palace was never stronger, never more valuable. If it is propaganda to boost the morale of civilians at home and troops abroad, the BBC broadcast royal propaganda.
And there'll always be in England that to stand before the world as the symbol and citadel of freedom and to be our own dear home.
Hitler, above all, knew the power of propaganda. He knew he had to undermine Allied faith in the steadfastness of the King.
Broadcast by the King or Queen.
I think it is extremely important that either or both of their majesties should broadcast a message not only to their own people, but to the world. The German propaganda machine will undoubtedly try to convince the world that the royal family will leave London.
The Queen, meanwhile, addressed herself to the women throughout the world and working on the home front.
How often, when I admired their pluck, have I heard them say, "Oh well, it's not much. I'm just doing my best to help us win the war." And have you not met that enemy too? You have endured his bombs. You have helped to put out the fires that he has kindled in our homes.
Never had royalty, the family firm, worked as such a family team. The princess spoke to the homesick legions of evacuees. And there was a special message for the children of Belgium. The comfortable tradition of Christmas broadcasts continued as usual. The king himself was now more at home in front of the microphone and began to dread the annual ordeal a little less, thanks largely to one special BBC engineer.
The Queen Mother, as she is now, Queen Consort as she was in George VI's days, of course, still remembers the BBC and remembers not just the chaps who talked, but an engineer, one engineer particularly, Mr. R.H. Wood, was the chief OB engineer, who, without being cheeky or obsequious or pushing, treated the King and Queen almost as friends. And during the Christmas broadcast, for instance, when the King was nervous, Mr. Wood, and the Queen Mother has reminded me of this more recently, said, "Well now, ma'am," and the Queen was looking after the King very much with the script, the Christmas broadcast script, said to Mr. Wood, "Couldn't we alter this?" And R.H. Wood said, "No, ma'am, he'll be as happy as a sandbag when he gets to the microphone and sees this." He was a North Midlander and he had an accent. He was a lovely man, full of malaprops. He said, "No, he'll be all right." And then the Queen Mother again said, "Couldn't we just alter this, Mr. Wood?" Ignoring the producer and talking to the engineer, this famous Mr. Wood, and saying, "No," he said, you know, His Majesty has buttered his bread and he must lie on it." And then, after a few more sherries, Mr. Wood became more kindly towards the King. They knew him and he knew them, there at Sandringham. He said, "Well, I think we could just alter that. He's finding it a bit difficult. But you know, ma'am," he said to the Queen, "you know, ma'am, you've been preaching to the perverted all the time."
In fact, it was Wood, even more than the Director General, I reckon, who really made royalty trust the BBC and made the partnership between them, which has grown all through the years. But it was the foundation he laid and the confidence that he'd engendered that really made the royals feel that they could trust the BBC.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Do you remember me, Jasmine Bligh?
Television came back with victory, the victory parade, and confidence in its future.
We came out of the war, the BBC's prestige enormously high, and on that high wave, I rode into Buckingham Palace, and I said, "Look, we ought to have somebody looking after the royal family. They're doing all sorts of interesting things, the King and the Queen and the princesses. We've only got a few lines on the agency tapes." But the next thing that happened, they said, "Go down tomorrow to see the King's secretary," which I did at Buckingham Palace, rather reluctantly, about this possible job. After 2 minutes, I was whisked along a corridor by a flunky. A door was opened, and the man said, "This is Mr. Talbot, Your Majesties." And there was my interview board in the palace. The King and Queen, our present lovely Queen Mother, was sitting there with the teacups. For the next 3/4 of an hour, I was there with them. I didn't realize I was being grilled, but I was in the nicest possible way. And they talked to me about myself, drew me out, and also made it quite clear to me that they knew my business. They'd looked and listened, were very much au fait with what the BBC were doing. Indeed, I'd met the King during the war on battlefronts. He said, "My goodness, Talbot, we listen to you after the 9 o'clock news, always. Very glad to meet you. You're taller than I thought you were." And that was how, by accident, I became the BBC's first royal chap.
But royalty was becoming a more feminine affair. The BBC felt it needed a female royal chap.
With the princess as heir to the throne, opinions were at last changing slowly about the necessity of having a full-time woman commentator. I got little encouragement from my colleagues, dyed-in-the-wool news reporters to a man. Even Richard Dimbleby was prejudiced. Audrey, do give this idea up. There never will be a successful woman commentator. Why? Oh, they haven't got the stamina. I think I was quite proud because I thought, well, dash it, I am the first woman in that particular job. A very well done job, too.
I remember once in full flight on one royal occasion describing the Queen as being beautifully dressed in dark black, whatever that was from the fashion point of view. And naturally, we were delighted when Audrey Russell joined us. And no sooner there was any question of describing royal dress, the Queen's dress, than over to Audrey Russell was the order of the day.
It's a most beautiful dress. Essentially, it's a very modern one, and yet it has a feeling of the past to it and an almost ethereal quality. It's of ivory white satin, and the whole dress is most delicately embroidered with seed pearls and crystals and garlands of white York roses entwined with ears of corn. The whole effect really looks as if the dress came out of a fairy tale.
Newsreels covered Princess Elizabeth's wedding, but television was banned inside the Abbey. The palace believed, wrongly, that its cameras were noisier and needed more light.
Of course, in the immediate post-war days, the establishment were very skeptical about television. They regarded it rather as sort of a peeping Tom. And I think that's why we had so many restrictions, particularly in relation to the royal family.
Some of the royal family were disconcerted by the very silence of live cameras. With the newsreels, they could hear the whir of the cameras. With television, they were never quite sure when they, royalty or the cameras, were on. Television and the magazines which published pictures taken from the screen captured every unguarded, unedited moment. Some could cope with it. But there was royal unease about the silent, close-up intruders. They were told to keep their distance.
We were a very new medium. We hadn't got a very large audience in those days, so I suppose perhaps we were, kept in our place, as you might say, till we proved ourselves.
The coronation of Queen Elizabeth in 1953 was to be the biggest ever television spectacular. The BBC pressed every camera into commission to carry the ceremony to all corners of the kingdom.
So the matter was put to the Prime Minister, who shared the view of the Earl Marshal and the Archbishop that the strain on the Queen would be too great. And he asked the Cabinet their views, and they all agreed with him. So he went to Buckingham Palace for his weekly audience, and he told the Queen that the unanimous view was that the coronation should not be televised inside the Abbey. To which the Queen said, I don't quite know how she put it, but effectively she said, rubbish, of course the coronation will be televised. How could, to have all this and then for the people as a whole not to see it would be ridiculous.
And for the first time in history, through the medium of television, the ancient and noble rite of a coronation service will be witnessed by millions of Her Majesty's subjects.
At the coronation, we were still theoretically working within the rule whereby there were no, what one today would call real close-ups of any member of the royal family. And of course, at the coronation, this would really have spoiled that wonderful shot that we were able to get of Her Majesty as she left the altar. I took a calculated risk, and I put it up on preview, and I looked at Ben Shaw, one of our engineers, and he looked at me.
And I had a censor button which was there in case of emergency. One reason for the censor button was the rule that there should be no close-ups. Now, the Queen had been crowned. She was coming down the aisle. I can see her now. Gorgeous it was. Bill Wright was on the camera, and she came closer and closer and closer. I looked at Peter, and Peter looked at me, and we both decided it wasn't a close-up. Under no circumstances would I have pushed that censor button. I thought the picture was gorgeous. She was gracious, she looked beautiful, and I will never forget it.
On the day and on many other royal days, Richard Dimbleby was as much a part of the ceremony as the heralds, the trumpeters, and the guards.
So, to that stirring music, majesty, splendor, and beauty pass from our sight as the Queen goes in her lovely robe out of the nave of the Abbey. History has been written and sung here today, in this worn and beautiful old building, where it has been written and sung for many hundreds of years. But never before have so many seen the crowning of the sovereign, or so many shared in her dedication in this Abbey Church, which in its changing forms has sheltered the crowning of our kings and queens for nigh on 1,000 years.
The coronation, of course, was by definition an exclusive BBC event, and it was the biggest single factor in developing television in this country.
I mean, it had been very non-new to admit at a dinner party that you watched television, but immediately after the coronation, everyone was trying to get a set. Aerials were going up because the Smiths had it, the Jones had to have it, and it was just a complete change. And television had been the poor relation of Broadcasting House and BBC Radio. They'd always rather look down their noses at us, but the moment the coronation had taken place, all that changed.
On television itself.
I feel my knighthood is a very great honor for the television service, and I am very happy to receive it on their behalf.
After the television coronation, people wanted to see more of the Queen, as they'd wanted to hear more of her father after his broadcast ceremony. So a new Christmas tradition was born.
We thought it would be very helpful for the Queen to see a professional speaking a Christmas broadcast, or a previous one. And so I asked Sylvia Peters if she would come to the studio to record a previous Christmas message, which she did, and this was shown to the Queen to point out certain aspects of the use of the teleprompter, the script, etc.
I was sitting at a table with a script, and I merely started by looking at camera and saying I was going to demonstrate 5 different ways in which you could put over a speech on television. And the first method, I don't know who dreamed this up because it was terrible, was to learn it, which would have been almost impossible for a Christmas broadcast. So I just learned a little bit of the script. Then went on to another method, which was to treat it as a radio broadcast and look at the script all the time without raising your eyes, just reading the message. And then I demonstrated a third method, which was to use the teleprompter. And that meant looking at the teleprompter all the time, not taking your eyes off, not moving your head too much, and not looking at the script. And the fourth method was to read the script, basically, but look up every now and again, sort of rather like that, which I think is a very fidgety way of doing something which I've often seen newsreaders have to do if their teleprompter breaks down and they're virtually reading a script and trying to look at the camera every now and again. And then the final method was to basically use teleprompter all the time, but at certain points in the script, to look quite deliberately at the script, to give a change of pace and change of movement of the head. And I'm very happy to say the Queen chose that method, which is quite difficult because you can lose your place either on the screen or in the script. But she did use that with great success.
And I suggested to the Queen that if she could only think of one or two people that might be sitting round a fire in a cottage, listening and watching her, rather than of a vast audience, millions, listening and watching. And she thought about this very carefully and said, I know exactly the people I shall talk to. It's a farmer and his wife who live on the Sandringham estate, and I will aim my broadcast at them. Because that is the essential of a good broadcast, intimate broadcast. The Queen isn't, although the Queen in fact is talking to the whole Commonwealth, it should look as if she's talking individually to every single person in the Commonwealth.
Happy Christmas. 25 years ago, my grandfather broadcast the first of these Christmas messages. Today is another landmark, because television has made it possible for many of you to see me in your homes on Christmas Day. My own family often gather round to watch television, as they are at this moment. And that is how I imagine you now.
The Queen, at a dinner a little while afterwards, told us that after the broadcast was over, when she and the royal family came out of church at Sandringham, the next time they came out, she noticed that instead of there being the usual 1,000 spectators, there were 10,000. And she saw that she was a television personality as well as the Queen. She realized clearly the impact of television.
But television's impact was double-edged. The more people saw of the Queen, the more they saw how little they knew of her. Her very appearances seemed to make her more remote. She made speeches, but never seemed to talk. She did official things, but was there a person underneath the protocol? A panorama program in 1966 expressed television's frustration at the two-dimensional image it projected.
We can't hear what the Queen says. Microphones are not permitted near her. The bystander, however close, is always at a distance. Only those directly involved participate. A little of the palace mystique comes with her on tour. If the camera edges too close, the royal detective places himself between it and the Queen.
She looked really nice, didn't she? She did, yeah. To what, when you see her on the television, she seems to be miserable. Tense. Miserable. And tense, yeah. Yes.
I think a lot of people, and myself included, were very worried the sort of way that the Queen and Prince Philip, but mainly the Queen, were sort of people they appeared to be on television. It wasn't at all what they were really like. And, you know, they appeared rather wooden and not very amusing, and their sense of humour never came over. And it did strike me what a pity this was, because, you know, they simply weren't like that. And that's why originally I suggested to Prince Philip and then later to the Queen that what about having a film made?
Well, of course, the crew were apprehensive. You know, we didn't know what to expect, and not in fear and trembling, but we're quite... You gentlemen all received your photographs. So all the chaps, Edwards and that, said, yes, thank you very much. I said, well, you do realise you've put us in a very embarrassing position by sending us those photographs. So the Queen said, why is that, Mr. Gorringe? I said, well, all the chaps have been queuing up at Harrods to buy grand pianos to put them on.
When I first joined the BBC and I look back on it, it was entering a mystery. There was a royal surrounding of air of reserved, shut away from the general public. But radio and television have brought royalty right in the firing line. They are right close into your home. You expect to see them on the telly. They do commentaries themselves. It's a totally different changeover in image.
As early as 1957, the royal family became more than merely the passive subjects of the lens. Prince Philip was the first to stride into the studios and prove his own mastery of the medium.
War, argument and controversy are news. Peaceful cooperation is a bore. I think that partly explains why so little has been heard about the International Geophysical Year until quite recently.
Not all that long ago, when children were even smaller, and people had especially hairy knees, there lived an old man of Lochnagar.
The most sumptuous collaboration between monarchy and the medium was Royal Heritage, a documentary feast of the royal treasures of the House of Windsor. It was presented by Sir Hugh Weldon, but even he had to take a back seat to the star.
The Imperial State Crown. Anyone who's been to the Jewel House at the Tower of London will know there are several crowns to be seen there, but only 2 of them are actually used. The St. Edward's crown and this one, known as the Imperial State Crown. It's normally kept at the Tower, but I have it here at Buckingham Palace because I wore it this morning at the state opening of Parliament. The crown, as you see it now, was made for Queen Victoria in 1838, but many of the individual stones have a much longer history. The oldest is probably this sapphire, which is said to have been worn as a ring by Edward the Confessor nearly 1,000 years ago. The pearls are said to have belonged to the first Queen Elizabeth.
The next thing was that royals were willing then to almost alter the ceremony or help the ceremony to be televised and broadcast in the best possible way.
The investiture of the Prince of Wales was designed for the camera. The canopy was of clear perspex so that in the medieval studio of Carnarvon Castle, television could get a better view. Lord Snowdon worked with the stage director Carl Toms and John Pound of the Ministry of Works to show the ceremony to the widest possible public.
It was very important to make it into a television production that was going to be viewed at home, in people's sitting rooms, so that when you were sitting alone watching it, you thought you were there. I wanted the castle to speak for itself. I didn't want red carpets. I wanted them to walk across the grass, and so you've just got the simple green grass, and then 4,000 scarlet chairs. I wanted to design it for the 400 or 500 million viewers, rather than like it was in 1911, when it was just for an elitist few of maybe 4,000 people.
You know, it's very difficult. One can be so cynical about this sort of thing and think, well, oh, it's only a ceremony and some people are against it, and, you know, perhaps it's for television and, you know, it's just a show. Yes, one can think that. But I like to think it's something a little bit more than that, that perhaps it is symbolizing Ichthyen, if you like.
Having completed her official duties in the capital, the princess went up country.
Unsurpassed in its coverage of ceremonial, the BBC was slower than ITN to see the news value of what the royals actually did.
A leper camp.
Journalists like Kate Adie, first television court correspondent, helped make up the lost ground.
The Princess's visit brought exclamations of appreciation for the British royal family.
I love the whole of them. I've got their pictures.
Why do you love them?
Yeah, because they wanted to help us in West Africa.
Royals were becoming newsy. Every bulletin had more and more royals in it. So I became full-time court correspondent with the brief that they should be treated as news. You know, I was told, one mention of frocks and you're out. It was on a tour of India with Prince Charles, the first big tour that I'd ever done with a member of the royal family, that I became very aware that things were probably changing. There'd always been rules that microphones didn't go near royalty. They didn't actually speak unless they launched a ship or opened something. They didn't have conversation. Or reporters, on the other hand, didn't have ears. We were earless, and somehow the words should never be reported. We went around India and Nepal in a fairly small press group, very informal tour, and we found ourselves having conversations with Prince Charles. He spoke, which sounds ridiculous now to mention that, but then it was considered something of a great step forward, and it seemed perfectly natural.
As promised, I'm as disheveled as I could be.
Could we ask you how you found the trip?
It was great fun, it was marvellous. It is the most marvellous bit of country, it really is. And once you get up on the hills, the views are spectacular, really spectacular.
18 here, one, take one. We reached a sort of high point of having fun, partly at his expense. We were in Bombay at the film studios. He was going to meet the stars, so the Royal Reptile Pack determined that, yes, he was going to meet the star, very pretty little Indian film star. And it was said to her by the more daring members of Fleet Street, he does, being a prince, of course, expect to be welcomed properly. And she, saucer-eyed, said, "How do you mean?" And they said, "Well, you plant a big kiss on him." And she said, "Oh, really? Are you sure?" And we all stood there. I admit, including the BBC, pretending that we weren't quite sort of in it. The BBC was above this sort of thing. What a lie. We formed a funnel-like line so that he couldn't escape. Stood there at the back thinking this is going to be great. And he turned around, he looked at us all, and we were waiting there, and he said, "You bastards."
There's a slight danger that too much camera prying, too much sound, radio, too much performance on the media can rather, shall I say, tarnish the little mystical side of the monarchy, and it does need it. I mean, it's all very well in Scandinavia, monarchs go bicycling around the parish, as it were, but I think we still haven't quite reached the point here. And I think there is a slight danger that we might just go over the top a bit. Haven't done it yet, but the danger is always there. Because after all, the monarchy, let's face it, it's the most sensitive show on earth.
Were you nervous? Were you nervous about going to public school?
No, I think I did actually rather quite look forward to it, in many ways.
And how did they treat you? Was there any bullying done? I imagine there wasn't really, knowing you. Or at least being aware of you.
I wasn't that big a girl.
Well...
no, I don't think so. No, I wasn't really aware of any.
Was
but
there
I didn't
any...
exactly set out to. I was very quiet and kept my eyes and ears open.
Was there any toadying done by teachers or fellow pupils? Crawling?
I know what you mean.
And I wanted to ask you one thing in particular, because you've been landed with it. This nickname that you have.
I'm listening. Which nickname?
I feel a bit embarrassed. Randy Andy.
I'll tell you exactly where that originated from. My second day at public school.
You were 14, 15 years old?
I'm afraid so. I was unfortunate enough in my early days at Gordonston not to realise the rules of the house, which were that you weren't allowed in the girls' house.
I don't believe this.
That's absolutely true. And I was unfortunately caught going through a door in the girls' house saying hello to somebody. And it stuck. Not many people use it nowadays, but I don't think that it actually fits today, anyway.
I don't think we've spoilt the mystique. I hope we never come to a weekly royal family film or something of that kind. I think that would be a pity. But there is an urge from not only the public, but from the newspapers, to get as much royal coverage as they can.
I suppose there might be some people who will begin to think in terms of a prince and princess going on and on and on in some sort of soap opera fashion, unless great care is taken to distinguish between the two.
The distinction is sometimes deliberately blurred. This was an American television trailer for a 1985 stateside tour. Can British television resist the temptation to turn the royals into a constitutional Carrington saga?
So stay tuned, Washington. The show opens November 8th in the U.S. Capitol.
It has been said that the royal family are tending rather to become a kind of royal soap opera because of the more and more frequent and relaxed appearances. I don't agree with that point of view at all. I think the royal family are very conscious of that danger. They're well able to look after themselves and prevent it happening. What I see the main connection between television and the royal family in the way of spectacle is pageantry. And pageantry is totally different from soap opera. Soap opera has a light, frivolous, perhaps even vulgar, sensational side. Pageantry is founded in history and tradition. It's full of symbolism. It tells you about our monarchy and how it's developed. And nothing in the world can show it so well as the television camera. To my mind, the single incident, or rather it was a dual incident because it was repeated, which really shows the connection between real history and television history, was what I would call the kiss on the balcony. Now, this was a unique occasion because the public intervened and made its demand, both of television and of the royal family, that they should cooperate. And they cooperated. They shouted out, kiss her, which they were only too pleased to do.
That's what everybody's been waiting for.
Make out. I'm not surprised she can't hear, and I don't suppose she imagines. Oh, that's what it was.
Criticised as too familiar if they play along with the camera, or too remote when they keep their distance, the royal family has had an awkward relationship with the broadcasters from the earliest days. But it's a relationship of mutual convenience, for in the end, both broadcasters and the monarchy know they need the people.
I am particularly pleased to pay a tribute to the BBC in its anniversary year, because I know how much it has meant to people all over the world to be able to take part in great national and state occasions, and also to witness some of the domestic events of my family. My grandfather, King George V, broadcast from the British Empire exhibition at Wembley as long ago as 1924.
Looking at you from out of the blue, don't make a fuss, but settle down and look at our view.
1987 was the year of the royal soap opera, the year of Dallas Palace. It was all good fun for the headline writers, and the results of an ITN opinion poll suggest that people do welcome the royal family's more popular image. We like the idea of them doing normal jobs and saying what they like in public. But at the same time, people are less sure about the effect of all this on the royals' traditional mystique. Some of the younger members of the family have certainly enjoyed a fair share of the limelight this year, and none more than the latest arrival on the royal scene, the Duchess of York. Beloved by the tabloids as Fergie, a name she hates, her first overseas tour to Canada with Prince Andrew was a great success.
The impact is the impact of a person who has sprung fully formed into the royal family, unlike the Princess of Wales, who was an empty slate on which anything could be written in terms of training and this sort of thing. She is a strong character from the beginning, and a character, it would seem, that cannot be changed by household, family, whatever. That character is there. There was the incident of the fur coat in Canada. Now, the Queen with her training, and even the Princess of Wales with hers, would have looked at the coat, touched it, but never put it on. She put it on because that is part of the character. There's a certain amount of over-the-topness with this girl, which is no serious criticism. It's fine, it's refreshing. But she did put it on, regardless of the impact that furs and things like that would make in Britain. That's what she wanted to do, and she wanted to make the gesture at the end. And then no more than a few days later, here she is receiving the head of a bull, which could be construed as a buffalo head, because that's what they were doing at the time. They were a head-smashed-in buffalo jump. She pats it, gets extremely friendly with it. It is not the sort of thing you would see in other members of the family. In that sense, perhaps she doesn't care what she does, and it would also seem that she doesn't care what she says.
The whole trip was a photographer's dream, with the young couple appearing in a series of fancy dress locations, from Victorian frock coat and crinoline to Dallas-style hats to tourist oilskins at Niagara Falls. Their fun-loving image was most apparent at the final banquet.
The commentator's delightful phrase, it's wild, it's woolly, it's western, and good watching. Like my wife. Sorry. Before I have my head smashed in, I mean my wife's hair.
Wrong tonight, because normally I check his speeches and he slipped that in about woolly, western, whatever.
The newest arrival typifies the greater freedom of the young royals, becoming the first royal duchess to get a pilot's license, complete with very un-Biggles-style hair grips. And she's now won her helicopter wings too. But much as the press love her, the unrelenting interest can prove embarrassing. Her unsuspected fear of snakes was pitilessly exposed during this trip to an American zoo. And she came in for some criticism during a tour of the Bordeaux vineyards for liking the product too much.
Well, it's very good wine. This barrel's for me. Come on, baby.
The press, always looking for news storylines, now decided the Princess of Wales had been led astray by her sister-in-law. She even felt bound to respond to this charge in a public speech accepting the freedom of the City of London.
Contrary to recent reports in some of our more sensational Sunday newspapers, I have not been drinking, and I am not, I can assure you, about to become an alcoholic.
What's okay for the Duchess of York is not seen as okay for the wife of a future monarch, and after her horseplay in the royal enclosure at Ascot, she apologised to the Queen.
Palace's reaction to the incident was a certain amount of displeasure. They considered it was not the sort of thing that normally happens at Royal Ascot. They mark it down for this year as an own goal. It does, to an extent, show an influence which the Duchess of York has on the Princess of Wales, an influence which is expressed in her saying, look, we both have a job to do. It is often a difficult job and sometimes a boring job, but there's no reason why we shouldn't have fun doing it.
She is the Princess of Wales. It's unfortunate for her that she's only 25 or whatever it is now, and that she enjoys a lively social life and would like to be down the road in the cinema watching Crocodile Dundee in a normal cinema, in a normal environment, but I don't feel that that is something that she can do.
The Princess of Wales has a way of putting herself down. She called herself thick as a plank this year, and during a visit to her old school admitted that she's not exactly brain of Britain.
And in spite of what Miss Rudge and my other teachers may have thought at the time, I did actually learn something. Though you would never have known by my O-level results.
One of her few ways of expressing herself is as an ambassador of British fashion. But the public parade sometimes hides private stress. At the Cannes Film Festival, few realise that she'd just been told that morning of the death of an old friend, a former royal detective in a motorbike crash. The princess goes out of her way to support her staff, as she did by attending the wedding of her dresser, Faye Marshalsea. And she set a more public example when she visited a new AIDS ward, shaking hands with one of the first patients to be admitted. The princess has never missed or postponed an official engagement. Many of them are to do with children's charities, something that she obviously feels most at home with. But it's true that she has different interests and a different circle of friends from her husband, Prince Charles. The things they do have in common, like an interest in skiing, should in a perfect world be the things they like to be seen doing together. But every year, the beginning of their skiing holiday has become something of an ordeal, because the press corps comes on winter holiday too, and in even greater numbers this year, because the Duke and Duchess of York went skiing with the Waleses. But the royal advisors had a plan.
The Prince and Princess of Wales will be called on radio through Richard Aylard, who has communications with the skiing party. Prince and Princess and the Duke and Duchess will then come to the location where the press will be assembled. They will ski towards you, stop in front of you for the photo opportunity, and then ski away.
Commander Aylard's operation was going according to plan. The press fell in, but it clearly didn't relax the prince, for whom photo calls are a pet hate. His wife and sister-in-law were, if anything, too relaxed. The pictures that went round the world appeared to show two young wives being reproached by one rather older husband for being too childish. and the apparent division began a year of press speculation that the royal marriage was in trouble. The prince soon set off on a series of solo trips abroad, including a 3-nation tour of Africa. In many ways, this was rather like a tour from the prince's bachelor days. He even joined in the local fertility dance. It was all intended to promote the Commonwealth Development Corporation, not a point that was widely reported. According to the British press, it was more to do with the prince meditating in the desert with his mentor, Sir Lawrence van der Post. But tongues really started wagging when the couple spent their wedding anniversary apart, he visiting woodlands in the Duchy of Cornwall, she presenting a pennant to the Hussars in Hampshire. And after a brief stay in Balmoral, the princess returned to London while he stayed in Scotland. It was said he was managing the family estates, but they didn't see each other again for over a month. Royal watchers disagree about the significance of all this.
Well, certainly the signs are that the honeymoon is over, and they have been apart for a considerable amount this year. Prince Charles has been off to Italy sketching, he's been off in southern Africa trekking, he's been up in Scotland fishing, farming, almost doing anything he can to be away from Kensington Palace.
Last year, the Prince of Wales spent a very considerable time at Balmoral on his own, while the Princess of Wales was back down in London. She has a well-known dislike of damp Scottish heather bogs. Nobody at the time noticed it. People's attention was diverted by something else, I don't know what. When it happened again this year, it suddenly attracted a lot of attention. It's not as unusual as it appears. I think you must remember that the royal family are not like the rest of us.
Of course, the prince and princess still carry out joint engagements like their visits to Spain and Portugal. These should be happy occasions that improve relations between Britain and the host country. But they do involve stresses and strains, because for all the careful planning, anything could still go wrong. They're never under greater pressure than when ploughing through a crush of sightseers and photographers.
The crowds are utterly daunting, and she's expected to step out of a car into a completely alien environment and speak to hundreds of thousands of people who are all listening to every word that falls from her lips and recording it for posterity. I think that's really frightening, and I think she handles it actually very well.
The princess believes she has a duty to support at least some of her husband's interests, like his polo matches, and she regularly turns up with the children. When his team wins, who else would present the captain with the cup? It's clear that when not appearing officially, she sees her main role as looking after the children, who both started new schools this year. In fact, the much publicised departure of Prince William's nanny, Barbara Barnes, had much to do with the princess's desire to build a closer relationship with her son. Introducing his younger brother Harry to his old nursery school, the 5-year-old Prince William showed he still has a boisterous spirit, but his new nanny is said to have taken a firm line with the future heir to the throne. And more recently, Prince Harry has been taking just as firm a line with the press. They, for their part, had whipped up the marriage rift story to its peak by the time the couple were reunited after a month apart to visit Welsh flood victims. One newspaper even called in an expert on body language to analyse their behaviour. But at the end of the day, Prince Charles went straight back to Scotland. It seems that their closest advisers felt unable to suggest any change of plan for fear of upsetting them.
Well, certainly there have been occasions, for example, when they went to look at the flood damage in Wales, and he went back off to Scotland again, and she went to Kensington Palace, where, just for the sake of the media, and not just the British media, for the worldwide media, where they should have stayed together. And in fact, the case is now where, in America, publishers won't take royal books on Princess Diana because they believe that 1988 will see the divorce of Charles and Diana.
The turning point came at the start of the official visit to Germany, when the prince seemed to go out of his way to demonstrate his affection for his wife.
But my wife came here for the first time in 1985, when she visited one of the British regiments stationed here in her capacity as one of the more glamorous colonels in the British Army.
That was enough to convince the press that whatever they'd reported before, the royal marriage was in good health again. And the message was reinforced a fortnight later when the royal couple visited the victims of the Enniskillen bomb blast. The whole affair seems to have blown the froth off the fairy tale romance, but since their marriage 6 years ago, it's only Prince Charles's popularity that's suffered. Asked which royal they'd most like to see visit their area, 16% of our sample named him, compared with 25% in a similar poll in 1981. The Princess of Wales's rating is now 18%, an 8-point jump from 6 years ago. She is noticeably more popular among women, while he scores better among men. That puts her almost equal with the Queen, the most popular member of the family, who's now fallen to 19% from 34%, though admittedly in a larger field now than then. But the number who don't want to see any of them has climbed to 15% from 9%. Some think the enormous interest in the royal marriage has shown the press at their worst, and they've been accused of concocting their stories.
It's just, you know...
All right, now we'll have the
You want to
story.
move straight to the story?
That's fine.
Did he say it or not?
Yes, he did say
200
it.
out of 10 for what?
He said that.
For what? For how Diana did in the present giving out ceremony.
Andrew Morton and the so-called Rat Pack spend their lives observing the royals, talking to family friends, looking for inside sources. Are they too intrusive?
The royal family will never be in a position to say, well, we're bringing the curtain down in our lives now and you've had enough and we want to be private from now on. It's impossible to expect the public to be interested only when they want them to be interested. Their hunger for information will extend beyond the normal civic and national duties that they perform.
Press continued to complain that the palace were being unhelpful and uncooperative.
The palace have a golden rule which they are unlikely to change, and that is that they will talk and be as helpful as possible about public engagements. They will not talk about the private lives of the members of the family. That is completely taboo. They say that the alternative to that would be spending hours answering the telephone, denying trivia, gossip columns, scandal in pop papers. And they say that would detract from the good works that the members of the family do, like, for example, the Prince of Wales projects.
But even those projects have landed Prince Charles in some hot water this year, as he searches for a role in what could be a long wait before he ascends the throne. He's continued to take a close interest in modern architecture, calling this factory a Victorian prison, and going on to attack office block development around St. Paul's.
Not only did they wreck the London skyline in general, they also did their best to lose the Great Dome in a jostling scrum of office buildings, so mediocre that the only way you ever remember them is by the frustration they induce, like a basketball team standing shoulder to shoulder between you and the Mona Lisa. You have, ladies and gentlemen, to give this much to the Luftwaffe. When it knocked down our buildings, it didn't replace them with anything more offensive than rubble. We did that.
Charlie, don't forget us, darling!
You've got a hell of a good voice.
There's no doubting the popularity of some of the prince's causes, like his growing anxiety about urban decay in the inner cities. During one of his many visits to the East End of London, he echoed the words of his great-uncle, Edward VIII, 50 years ago, saying something must be done. But some Tory MPs thought he might be straying too far into politics.
Well, I think there is a danger of that. Let me give you an example. If the Prince of Wales, for the sake of argument, goes to an institution in Birmingham which is designed to help young West Indians, if he says this is splendid work, that seems to me to be a proper role for the heir to the throne. If he says, my God, this is desperately underfunded, more money ought to be put into this project, that seems to me to be a political statement.
But Enoch Powell disagrees.
I don't see how he can go around and get experience and be at the centre of things as the Prince of Wales is expected to be without expressing opinions. And I don't see that any opinions which he has expressed are such as to enable people to say, well, now that proves that when he's monarch, there's only certain sorts of advice that he's going to accept.
The Prince has also had mixed luck with his charities. His Youth Business Trust has continued to provide funds for young entrepreneurs, but his Inner City Aid project, set up at the same time, ran into trouble when it found itself competing for funds. This charity was inspired and chaired by Prince Charles's friend and architectural advisor Rod Hackney. Some think it showed up the Prince's reliance on people the press have dubbed his gurus.
I think he's a basically rather insecure man. He doesn't have a very high opinion of himself. Therefore, he looks to other people for reassurance. And I think that he got a great deal of reassurance and encouragement from Lord Mountbatten. When Lord Mountbatten was blown up, it was a loss that was utterly devastating, and which I think really has not been filled.
But Prince Charles is unrepentant about his interventions over modern architecture and inner cities.
It's, after all, one of my rare opportunities to stir things up, to throw a proverbial royal brick through the inviting plate glass of pompous professional pride, and to jump feet first into the kind of spaghetti bolognese of red tape which clogs this country from one end to the other.
But should he and other members of the royal family say whatever they like on controversial subjects? The answer seems to be yes. 59% of our poll said they should be free to say whatever they like to the press, compared with only 37% who think they should aim to remain neutral. That's a big shift since 1981, when our sample were equally divided. So they can say what they like, but can they do what they like? The dilemma of the young royals was highlighted this summer when Prince Edward played host to most of them taking part in a special charity edition of the BBC game show It's a Knockout. Princess Anne maintained a stiff upper lip about the whole proceedings.
Oh, very cool, calm, collected.
All this quasi-excitement doesn't really matter a damn to you, then?
No, we're the strong, silent types.
But not so the other team leaders, Prince Andrew and the Duchess of York.
Basically, we're the best. We're the best blue bandits there are.
Give me an L. Give me a U. Give me an E. What do you got? Big bad blue bandit.
The Queen's youngest son said while setting up this showbiz event that it would enable the public to see members of the royal family as ordinary human beings. And that's exactly. The headlines that followed were one of the many examples this year where royal and press intentions came into conflict.
Because he didn't get the support he wanted, he got up and walked out. I think perhaps he has got a little to learn there about how to handle the press in particular and how to project himself in general.
Our poll found the Prince is the least popular royal, with 11% saying he's the member of the family they'd least like to see. Princess Margaret is now down to 10%, after being the most unpopular in 1981 with 30%. Abroad, TV interest in the royals borders on fascination.
Your Royal Highnesses, we welcome you as two of the most popular television personalities the world has ever seen.
30 years ago, it was felt...
And in a television age, they're learning to use the medium directly. Prince Edward went on to make his own documentary about the Duke of Edinburgh Awards scheme, for which he interviewed his own father.
Do you think that it achieves what it set out to do?
I'm not really sure what it set out to do.
The Duchess of York appeared on a chat show with David Frost, talking about a book she helped to publish.
At the end of the day, when Andrew comes back, I have actually done something too. I haven't just been sitting there wondering what I'm going to put on the next day.
And then after that, you took the
Not to be outdone, her husband took part in a programme about his hobby, photography.
This is possibly, I think, my favourite camera. It's by far the most robust.
Even the Queen Mother got in on the act as the star of a film about her love of racing.
Sun rising. He's by Sunny Boy, so we hope he's going to be all right. Oh, well, it would be nice, you know.
And the Queen herself made media history by giving a doorstep interview like any politician or union leader.
You looking forward to the summit at all?
It's very interesting, I think. Rather busy.
Are you worried about Fiji, Sri Lanka?
Well, I think it's very sad, yes. Very sad.
Mr. Hawke thinks you've got a further statement to make on the
I
subject.
know, we've all been hearing that.
Is it true?
Ah.
No comment.
What we're seeing at the moment is the royal family hitching their wagon very firmly to television. Last year we saw the Prince and Princess of Wales making those documentaries about themselves. This year we've seen Prince Edward doing the It's a Royal Knockout, something a bit more flamboyant, a bit more extrovert. Next year, what are we going to see next year? The Queen Mother doing the hokey cokey down the mile? I don't know. So what the royal family have done is hitch their wagon to television, and television is essentially a very voracious medium. And are we going to see TV eating the royal family?
Television has already taken advantage of the royal glasnost to poke fun in Spitting Image.
On a happier note... No, cut the schmaltz, Granny. This is a ratings war, not amateur night. We're up against the Dusty Bin Christmas special, and we need gags, madcap humour, and men in tights running around with cucumbers on their heads, right?
I don't think in general we do necessarily treat them as figures of fun. I mean, the only time we're terribly mild in satirical terms about the royal family compared to what we would do with any politician. I think we don't so much treat them as figures of fun as an ordinary family. And it's the only times we're ever hard about them are when suddenly they're involved in things outside the royal family, when they start appearing on lots of television shows.
So, in general, would you say that a certain amount of royal family is what makes every edition of Spitting Image a good one?
It's nice to have a bit of them in there because they've become very strong characters. I mean, they're almost like a sort of running little bit of a situation comedy in our programme. Each one has their own character.
And the cast of characters grows almost every week, even extending to quite minor members of the royal family.
The Untouchables, starring Captain Mark Phillips.
Mr. Phillips, Your Highness, can you think of one good reason, apart from the real one, why I should let you out?
Well, Your Honour, I need my car because otherwise I can't drive very fast and break the law in it.
Case dismissed.
So are the royals just like us? Some observers thought Princess Anne's husband got off because of who he is, although the magistrates accepted that a car was vital for his work as a farmer. The Queen's nephew, Viscount Linley, wasn't so lucky. He was banned twice for speeding. Presumably his car wasn't thought to be essential for his career as a furniture designer. There's a big question mark over the career of Prince Edward after his decision to quit the Marines. It was a decision made after much soul-searching, and his father, Prince Philip, was reported to be angry, though a letter he wrote to the Marines' commanding officer, which was promptly leaked to The Sun, was more understanding of his son's predicament. The author of a book about the Royal Marines, published this year, says they were astounded.
When he left, they were, in their own memorable phrase, totally gobsmacked by they found it so hard to believe. And there was a very real sense of shock and surprise, because they could see no good reason why he should have left.
One reason suggested at the time was that he found the training too tough.
I have talked to Major Bancroft, his OC, about this, and we were well aware of his progress in training. He was doing well in his initial training, and he had all the physical equipment and acumen to have passed training in the Royal Marines.
In the upbringing of any young royal, and I'm not a royal watcher, so I have to just hazard a guess at this one, they're never really forced to mix with people who they don't necessarily like. Now, in that sort of training, you have to mix with people you don't necessarily like. You count on each other to get yourselves through. They saw him as being somebody who was isolated, definitely. They saw him as somebody who possibly tried a little bit too hard. I mean, in the beginning of his time down there, his nickname was Smartass. Always wanted to be seen to answer the question. And it's not always a good idea to do that. Sometimes you have to let other people have a chance, and sometimes it's good just to keep stum and not say too much. They saw him, I think, as somebody who almost felt that he had to be seen all the time to be in charge.
Whatever the reason, Prince Edward was praised in Parliament and the press for his courage in turning his back on a traditional royal career in the armed services. There was talk of a new life in the city or in industry. But the prince's own inclination seemed to be towards the stage. He immediately took on the unpaid job of patron of the National Youth Theatre, and even tried his hand personally, demonstrating what he called the Windsor knot when presented to some young actors. So he did learn something in the Royal Marines. And he trod the boards himself in an amateur production of Shakespeare's Winter's Tale.
When you speak, my sweet, I'd have you do it ever. And when you sing, I'd have you buy and sell so give alms, pray so. And when ordering your affairs, oh, to sing them too.
But the hard fact is that the only public stage where Prince Edward can really star is the traditional ceremony, like switching on the Regent Street Christmas lights.
There's something magical about lights, especially Christmas ones. So, without further ado, and with thanks to the designer and sponsors, stand well back while I throw this switch and utter those time-honored phrase, "Let there be light."
But do we want to see the young royals earning their living doing more ordinary jobs? One of Rupert Murdoch's editors, who this year supported the idea of making Princess Anne our next monarch, says the answer is yes.
Many of them don't appear to have a role in life, and that's out of place with the sort of society we're becoming rapidly as the children of Thatcherism. It is expected that people have proper jobs and they work hard and they become achievers. And some of the younger royals have failed to do that. Recently, Prince Andrew has broken away and has committed himself to a career in the Navy. And that's very worthwhile and demonstrates that at least he has got something that he wants to succeed in, whereas Edward and Charles are both still very much at the loose end.
According to our poll, an overwhelming majority think they should have normal careers or combine them with traditional duties, while less than a quarter say it's enough for them to concentrate on ceremonial and charity work. But what kind of career? 59% still think a traditional commission in the armed services is most suitable, followed by the civil or diplomatic service, the city or industry, or a profession like becoming a lawyer or doctor, while 11% think the media or entertainment would be okay. Is this realistic?
No, realistically it can't. Once you leave the armed services, which is the only role traditionally the royals have been able to play because it is a bland, non-political role, there is no job. You can't go into commerce, industry, law, journalism, whatever you like to mention, because at some stage a political issue would arise and that would not be a good thing in terms of members of the royal family. So you're left with the sort of thing that he's doing now, which is good works for the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, and a little bit of acting, but unfortunately on the evidence so far, the acting possibly will not make a career for him.
No one exemplifies the traditional royal career better than Princess Anne, created Princess Royal this year in recognition of her tireless work for the Save the Children Fund. Her trip to the Far East was only the latest of several in a packed timetable that makes her one of the hardest working royals. She also found time to pursue her amateur career as a jockey. She got off to a bad start, coming last on Knocknaqueel at Kempton Park, then falling off at Towcester, before her horse finally came through, giving the princess her first ever national hunt win.
Well, winning a race is always good news, I think, wherever you do it, but over fences, I think, for somebody like me, is probably a bit special.
The Princess Royal is definitely more popular. Only 5% name her as the one they'd least like to see, compared with a quarter 6 years ago. And 9% name her as the royal they'd most like to see, compared with only 1% in 1981. But in Tennessee, she showed that she still doesn't suffer foolish questions gladly.
Do you really like country music, and how did you come to like it?
I'm hoping to be able to tell you after I've heard the genuine article.
Have you ever heard it before?
No, I spend my life with my fingers in my ears.
Above all this controversy, public and domestic, stands the Queen. She seemed to emphasize the generation gap between her and the younger royals this year, by appearing for the first time at the Trooping the Colour ceremony in a carriage instead of on horseback. In the year of Inniskillen, the Queen went out of her way in her Christmas message to deplore the increasing amount of violence in the world. But she had problems of her own to face over the crisis in Fiji. Before the summit began, she'd taken the almost unprecedented step of appealing direct to the islanders, but that failed to stop the leaders of the coup renouncing her as their head of state. She was clearly anxious about a last-minute addition to her speech that was so late it almost didn't arrive on time. "Where's my speech?" she asked the palace official. The minutes ticked away as the banquet proceeded, but the missing section was at last found, handed over to a much-relieved Queen, and duly delivered.
I have been greatly saddened by recent events in Fiji, and I'm sure that all the other members of the Commonwealth will share my feelings. I know that you will join with me in praying for the future peace and happiness of all the people of Fiji, whatever their racial origins.
The former Fijian Prime Minister, who came to London in a last-ditch effort to get royal approval for the new constitution that emerged from the coup, failed to see the Queen and had to make do with her private secretary, Sir William Heseltine, instead. But was Heseltine wise to advise the Queen to intervene in the first place?
I think her intervention over Fiji was extremely well judged. It was prudent and it was well timed. The circumstances were strongly against her, and not even her wisdom could resolve them in a constitutional and favorable way. But she did everything possible to improve matters, and she's standing there still, now on the sidelines, ready always to help if she's called on.
A lot of people were rushing around and saying the Queen is doing this and the Queen is doing that and the Queen is going to say this and is going to say that. And then eventually, when the occasion arose at the Commonwealth Conference, what the Queen said was anything but an attempt to intervene in the course of events, and was only such an expression as you might think she could properly make in view of what had happened in Fiji.
No one suggests that the Queen is in any way responsible for the royal family's public image problems this year. But those problems remain. The big question is, do the public and the press expect too much?
One expects a royal to act in a superhuman way, as you would expect your local policeman or your local priest. And maybe that's unfair, but that is the way it is. And if a royal drives too fast or plays too much in public, the public doesn't like it. Now, the question really is, should one blame the young royal or should one blame the press? I personally think the blame should be put at both ends of the spectrum.
But even one of the world's leading experts on public relations thinks he would have difficulty advising them.
Well, I'm sure that it's very frustrating for the palace to deal with some of the stuff that's been in the papers, and I'm sure that maybe they're reacting by saying, look, if we give them nothing for a while, maybe they'll deal with it a little bit differently in the future, and there's certainly no other way that I can think of to do it, and I think it's perhaps unfortunately deserved, but again, it's very counterproductive for everyone, for the press, the public, and the royal family.
Most people still think the advantages of the royal family outweigh the costs, and those who think the opposite has remained unchanged at 22%. That's the kind of rating any politician would be proud of. But support for the royals has fallen from 76% in 1981, and the number who don't know has gone up to 7% from 2%. And on the young royals, only half think their behaviour has improved the standing of the royal family, while nearly a quarter think it's damaged its standing, and another quarter think it's made no difference. So, most people would rather have the royal family than not, but after a year which seems to mark some sort of turning point, they're more uncertain about what role they should play. They want them to remain royal, but with a common touch. How well the royals achieve that difficult balance will perhaps determine how popular they are in years to come.
Economic strength and development This is serious, you know.
I do, however, find it rather daunting to be standing up here and speaking in front of so many of you.
I'm not sure really whether it's a sensible thing for me to say anything nowadays.
Take it from me, you won't learn very much because this is really for your entertainment. You won't discover anything.
What did you think of it?
So we agreed, for once, that I should have the last word tonight.